Having concluded our look at the Proto-Renaissance, we now move on to the early Renaissance. Classical antiquity was reborn in Florence in the early part of the 15th century. Much like ancient Athens, Florence took great national pride in its prowess in wars and intellect both. Strong banking houses, in particular led by the Strozzi and Medici families in Florence, helped spur Europe to recovery from 14th century disasters. The Medici house and others became lavish patrons of the arts with much the same attitude as the artists, performing works of service to the community, both intellectual and religious factions, and with an eye toward personal, lasting fame. Now, doubtless both methods were served well. By combining the principles and theories forged from the records and works of the ancient world with those of the new humanist philosophers of the 14th and 15th centuries, an entirely new mode of artistic expression took hold. In many ways, the artists of the second half of the century did not surpass their predecessors, yet are of immeasurable importance in their often presumed roles as teachers of the artists of the high Renaissance to come. Now, three Florentine artists, Donatello in sculpture, Masaccio in painting, and Brunelleschi in architecture, forged the ideas that would inaugurate the art of the Renaissance, which was structured in principles and theories. Now, added to typical religious subjects was an emphasis on human worth and dignity, with great value placed on individualism in the artist's style. Now, as we look at architecture, we see that in the first half of the 15th century, many ancient buildings had survived in Italy to this period. Some were inhabited, others were merely empty reminders of the classical past. Now, in order to understand the logic of classical designs, Brunelleschi, along with Donatello, made a trip to Rome to carefully measure all the ancient Roman buildings that they could find. And this then leads us into understanding the 4 R's of Renaissance architecture. The first R is Rome. There was a passion for the classical among these architects. They revived elements like the rounded arch, concrete construction, the domed rotunda, the portico, the barrel vault, and columns. The second R of Renaissance architecture is rules. Renaissance architects considered themselves scholars, so their work was based on theories that were expressed in various treatises. The third R is reason. These theories emphasized architecture's rational basis grounded in science, math, and engineering. And our fourth R, of course, has to be arithmetic. And they depended on this to produce beauty and harmony with systems of ideal proportions and layouts that relied on geometric shapes, particularly the circle and the square. The first early Renaissance architect that we're going to look at is indeed Filippo Brunelleschi. And Brunelleschi, in addition to being an architect, was skilled as a goldsmith, sculptor, mathematician, and clock builder. Brunelleschi achieved 3 tremendous feats in his career. First, he discovered mathematic perspective. Second, he championed the central plan church that replaced the modern basilica. And third, he constructed a dome for the Florence Cathedral, and this was called the 8th wonder of the world. For these reasons, Brunelleschi is known as the father of modern engineering, as he was able to utilize all of his abilities to solve previously unsolvable problems. Now, Brunelleschi's great challenge that we see here was that of constructing a dome to span Florence Cathedral, and this dome was some 140 feet across. He had to work with constraints of previously completed wall structures, and this eliminated possibilities of buttressing, and monetary restrictions. The cost of traditional wooden centering for a dome this size would have been astronomical. So Brunelleschi designed a dome within a dome around a skeleton of 24 ribs, 8 of which are visible on the outside. Now, rather than tilting inward from the weight, as one would expect, Brunelleschi's dome tilted outward as a result of having to deal with existing walls. The heavy lantern that you see at the very top helps rather than hinders in adding weight and stability to the form. Now, no doubt this triumph had a lot to do with the fact that Brunelleschi basically occupied himself as an architect from this point forward. One interesting sidebar to the dome on the cathedral is the fact that a competition was held in order to select what architect would construct the dome, and Brunelleschi won the competition. And then at every phase of the development, every phase of the construction, they saw fit to hold more competitions to see who would do the best job of constructing it, who would do the best job of finishing it off. And each time Brunelleschi had to, in a sense, reapply and win the competition once again to fully realize his dream for Florence Cathedral. Now, the Pazzi Chapel that we see here was one of Brunelleschi's own designs from the very start, and this reflected his ideal, the central plan structure. Brunelleschi's bold geometrical shapes do not reveal their structural functions, as we'd seen previously in a Gothic skeleton. His work also differs in scale. It's much smaller, and he seeks to reaffirm the greatness of classical antiquity by renewing classical proportions and components, such as are visible in the plan seen in your textbook, and the use of domes, barrel vaults, and columns that are perhaps better seen in the following images. This is Brunelleschi's Ospedale delle Innocenti, and Brunelleschi employed classical proportions and components, and he used domes, barrel vaults, and columns, such as we see here. This is Brunelleschi's Santo Spirito, and you see that his interiors also utilize classical elements and proportions. Now, the major force in architecture in the second half of the 15th century and far beyond was Leon Battista Alberti. Now, like Brunelleschi, Alberti's career as a practicing architect had been long delayed. Until the age of 40, Alberti seemed to have limited his interest in the fine arts by defining himself primarily as an historian and theoretician. The death of Brunelleschi in 1446 brought to the forefront Alberti's skill as an architect. Alberti would share Brunelleschi's predilection for classical forms, yet he sought to refine and question those forms in an effort to form an enduring legacy. Alberti was the first man to seriously study the single ancient treatise on architecture that survives, and this was Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture, which was written in the 1st century BC. Now, Alberti himself wrote major works on painting and sculpture, in addition to his own treatise on architecture. Now, Alberti had a wide variety of pursuits. He was a humanist scholar, a natural scientist, a mathematician, a cryptographer, among other things. While this is the case, it's important to note that his work in art was not that of a dilettante. In fact, when Alberti was forced to design by correspondence, he sought to make clear and control the smallest details in construction. Now, while Alberti praised Brunelleschi in his treatise and drew inspiration from many of the same classical sources, their work differs significantly in some cases. What we're looking at here is the Church of San Francesco in Rimini, and this incomplete church illustrates one major difference between Alberti's work and that of his predecessor Brunelleschi. Compared to Brunelleschi's Ospedale, one sees that Alberti did not use columns to support arches. Alberti was vehement in his rejecting this principle. This was an architectural form that Alberti found to be inferior, at least in his tastes. Now, Alberti's judgment in this matter influenced architecture for a great many years to come. Now, this building is more often referred to as the Malatesta Temple. It was originally a monastic church until the Renaissance tyrant Sigismondo Malatesta, a very naughty man, sought to wholly remodel the structure inside and out, with Alberti contributing what is now visible. Apparently, frescoes by Giotto were destroyed in the interior. That is truly a crime against art. Now, one classical source for this building can be found in the Arch of Constantine. Now, Sigismondo Malatesta wanted a temple to himself and his mistress Isotta, for whom he had caused his wife to be suffocated. Pope Pius II apparently was neither pleased nor amused by his activities. Therefore, Sigismondo Malatesta enjoys, if you want to call it that, the distinction of being the only man in history to be publicly canonized to hell in a solemn ceremony that was conducted by the Pope himself. Now, Alberti also envisioned a perfect hemispheric dome for this structure, quite unlike the Florence Cathedral solution of Brunelleschi. This bronze medal by Matteo de' Pasti shows what was planned had Sigismundo's fortunes not met with disaster that forced them to cease work on this temple in 1461. Ironically, it was Matteo de' Pasti's work that Alberti detested and had given a new exterior shell in the Malatesta temple. Alberti's triumph as a church architect was his design for Sant'Andrea at Mantua. Now, while this was built after his death, he died in 1472, and this was not built until 1481, it is nevertheless his crowning achievement. It's ironic that Alberti's great work was in the form of a church, a word that he could never bring himself to write. He always used the word temple, as in a Roman temple. The major importance of Sant'Andrea lies in Alberti's combining the triumphal arch with the temple format as seen at the top. Certainly the dome, and most likely the arch above the pediment, were neither designed by nor intended by Alberti. Now, Sant'Andrea compares to the Arch of Constantine and the Temple of Fortuna Virilis that we see here to the right. Alberti also recalled the massive Basilica of Constantine with his treatment of the interior. You see the interior at the top right of the slide, and the Basilica of Constantine in ruins at the bottom right. Now, Alberti rejected the three-aisled basilica plan of the early Christian churches, which had been the standard for 1100 years. In creating a place in which the gods, never God in Alberti's words, in which the gods could be worshipped, he invented a new plan that was based on a massive barrel vault, so that no columns could conceal ceremonies taking place at the altar in a church that was to exhibit the relic of the sacred blood of Christ. An interesting summation of early Renaissance architecture is found in the work of Giuliano da Sangallo, an architect who combined elements of both Brunelleschi's and Alberti's concepts in his work. Now, while he was perhaps not the inspired genius of his predecessors, Giuliano was the most imaginative Florentine architect of the later Quattrocento. The exterior here recalls the austere and severe quality of Alberti's work that we see to the right. Brunelleschi's work that we see to the right. The interior is very similar to the Pazzi Chapel. Again, the Brunelleschi piece that we see to the right. The facade of the building, on the other hand, is very closely aligned with what we've previously seen by Alberti. The domes of these two structures are also quite similar, and Giuliano's is quite beautiful with 12 oculi and a lantern casting light on a rich combination of Doric and Ionic forms. Again, we have Brunelleschi's work on the right and Sangallo's work on the left. The central plan church, perhaps not most functional for Christian liturgical purposes, was a favorite of all three architects. Now, Giuliano's is often suggested to be the ideal realization of this plan. That's not an unusual thing to have real innovators come along and pioneer exciting new ideas, but then to have somebody else come along a little bit later on that makes it just a little bit more palatable to the rest of the masses. And this concludes our look at early Renaissance architecture.